Tēnei tātou katoa, ki te mihi ki kinga tūheitia, po tātou te whiriwhiro te tua whitu. Ki koutou katoa, nā mihi nui kia te whare wānanga o Waikato. Nā mihi nui ki tēnei kaupapa ko Kirsten Petrie tuku ingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this University of Waikato run kōrero around the role coaches play in developing the whole person. We've got a really esteemed panel ready to contribute to their views on the role coaches play in developing the whole person. And I argue we've got them here because they come from a really humanistic perspective that's not solely about winning at all costs. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Takahutu Maxwell, who was supposed to be with us tonight, has been unable to join the panel. But just want to note that we will loop him back into our conversation later in the year. Anyhow, we're not going to kick off with a round of introductions. We haven't got time for that, but I take it that most of you would have either know these people or read about their profiles in other places. So we're going to kick straight to them, and I'm going to get them all to answer the question about what do you see the role as of the coach what is the role of coach when they're working with a team, an individual, or group? And I'm going to throw straight to you, Amy Jean, actually, to kick us off.
Yeah, kia ora tātou. Thanks, Kirsten. I think for me, primarily, it's bringing out the strengths of the individual and then collectively as the group on a very simple basis. People generally want to feel like they have something to contribute. They want to understand what their role is within a group and their place. And I think when they have that, then they know how they can contribute in the best way possible. In a team sense, it's obviously bringing everyone together, getting them working in the same direction. And I think what I found at the high performance level particularly is sometimes that's the hard thing is to get them all working together, because you've got a group of really driven, competitive people, and sometimes their roles change once they hit that high performance environment. So finding what their strengths are, acknowledging what their strengths are, identifying those, and knowing how to contribute those best to the team is important. And I think the last thing from me is that regardless of level or ability of where you're performing at, generally you want there to be more positive experiences than not.
Yeah, thanks for that. Flowing through to Shane and then Wayne and then Sean.
I would have liked to have started, I think. No, I agree with all of that. And how I see coaching for me is it changes, and changes in a couple of ways. It changes as your athlete starts to grow. So I think that often you bring an athlete into a program and how you are as a coach differs from when they exit a program. And I think that, that guide through their career is really important. And for you to be able to be a good guide, you need to understand the athlete incredibly well. And so a lot of the things that you do with your alignment of getting everyone working the same line comes down to understanding that person that stands in front of you. And so I think, that's why good coaching and coaching teams is incredibly rewarding, because of that dynamics and those different needs.
Yeah, for me, Shane, I love that saying of exit better than when they came in, because I've always been clear that that's been my role as a coach. I understood pretty early as a player that people will rise to a challenge if it's their challenge. They won't necessarily rise to my challenge or any other coach's or any other person's challenge. So that's always been the secret for me, is working on that empowerment, on players having a voice. I once heard Muhammad Ali speak at Harvard, and he got up on stage and he said, "Me, we," and then he went and sat down. The shortest poem in history. But to me, that sums up a lot of what teams are about. The me part for me in the All Blacks, when I was a player, you're expected every day to get up and try and be the best in the world, and that was a responsibility that you had on you. For myself, I knew I wasn't going to be a great player pretty early on, but I had this desire to be in great teams, and I knew that I could be a cog in that team and do everything I could to help that team perform, and that was the us part or the we part of that for me. So I use that a lot in my coaching, and I talk about that. And, anyone can follow the habits of the best in the world. You don't have to be a great at the game or the best in the world to do that. They're free. So having that as a skill or an attribute within the team, I think is important.
Cool. Well, I think most of it's sort of already been summed up, but from my perspective, as sort of from an athlete's perspective, the best sort of coaches, or the ones that have helped me the most, are the ones that can really read people and read teams. And I come from a rowing background where getting sort of team alignment is one of the most important things that you would ever need in a men's eight, which is the crew that I rowed in. And so that's where the role of the coach comes in for me, is that they are the facilitator, the motivator, the leader, and the person that aligns all the efforts. And so, a lot of things go into it, but mainly it's around building a team that has the chemistry to do well, and everyone within that team believes in themselves, believes in their own ability and in the team's ability.
What interests me about the comments that you've all made is that not many of you have talked about the technical or the tactical, and often as coaches we see coaches focus on technical skills, tactical skills for winning games. So Wayne, I'm really interested to know about, aside from that, or where you place technical and tactical alongside other knowledge, skills or attributes you really think we should be developing. What are the priorities?
It's a good question. I've been coaching since 1986, and so in my experience, sustained success has come from an emotional place more than the technical or tactical space. And when you talk to coaches about that, about working on identity, creating a vision-driven, values-based culture, they like the idea pre-season, but are too busy normally teaching the skills and the tactics to put the other stuff in place, because I think it should be around the other way. Not feeling that you belong to a team is an inhibitor to success. So it doesn't matter how good a coach you are, you're not going to get success unless those people have, what Owen Eastwood calls that sense of belonging, that sense of us. So creating an identity, knowing, who you are, where you've come from, your whakapapa of the team, how you honour them, how you leave a legacy is really important, and also how you can be unique as a team. You can see behind me an old photo. That's Kabuki Steelers in Japan, 94 years old team that I've been involved with for a few years. That's created a sense of legacy for us. In the All Blacks, we don't use the normal language of rugby, for example. So when I was coach of defence, I didn't like the word defence. To me, it's a negative word. So I really liked watching Willie Apiata in his interview after he got his VC. And I showed that to the players, where he talked about he just did what he did for his mates, basically. And we felt that was a better term for defence, so we called defence Wiremu in the All Blacks. So you don't have to follow the herd. You can create something really special, and I think that's way more important. The technical stuff comes in, of course, but having that sense of belonging is huge, and you're only stewards of whatever jersey you're in for a short time, and when you hand it on, you need to try and hand it on in a better state than when you got it.
So I guess one of the challenges for any coach, though, is there's always performance expectations, and some of you, whether we're working in a school team with rangatahi or we're working in high performance, sometimes your job's on the line and there's the expectation around performance outcomes. So Amy Jean and Shane, you've both been working across both those, all sorts of those environments. How do you balance the desire for performance outcomes alongside the development of the whole person, like Wayne's been talking about? How do you do that?
There you go, Shane.
Look, it's one of those funny things in life that if you focus on the right things, you get both, and as Wayne was saying, the setting up a nice platform at the beginning of year and working out, look, what does success look like for us? And there'll obviously be the winning of a tournament, things like that. But a lot of athletes will come up with I really want to enjoy it. I want to participate. I want to play a lot of the games and so on. Now, I think that a lot of the KPIs of coaches in those type of arenas needs to be aligned with what you actually want to achieve. You want athletes to have a lifelong love of the game and learn the skills that are going to better equip them even if they move out of the game, and success is not winning tournaments. Does that player go on and play the next season and then go on and do greater things with all the skills they've learned. So I think, investing early in creating that culture, that togetherness and that setting goals collectively allows you to start to move into the technical stuff that aligns with that. And very quickly you find that you get a lot of momentum and your teams become successful for two reasons. One is because they're fantastic teams and great people working together. And the second is the byproduct of that is you get good results, not the other way around. If you work too much on the technical and tactical and neglect the other, you've got a limitation. But collectively, you can achieve fantastic things.
Yeah, I totally agree, Shane, and it goes back to what Wayne's already talked about as well. And I think for me, a couple of things which have already been said, but clarity about where the team wants to go, where the athletes want to go. I think if you all know where you're heading and you all agree to that, you've all bought into that journey, then there's no surprises. The expectations are clear, and you can then define what sort of behaviours and what sort of I guess the values that surround that team that are going to help you get there. And by establishing those early, everybody sort of finds their role and how they contribute and what they bring on and off the field or the court or the playing arena. So I think, setting those, and sometimes that comes from the legacy. Sometimes that does come, when you've got a well-established team, sometimes those values are really entrenched and they're really clear, and the leadership group will continue to drive those year after year. But in each year or at each season or each campaign, you may have slightly different vision or outcome that you want to achieve that can be set by the players. But yeah, I think if there's clarity around where you're going and how you're going to get there, then agree. Sounds a bit cliche, but the results will look after themselves. They'll be what they are, and inevitably they will be successful.
Yeah. So we talk about success in interesting ways, and Shane, you just talked about success beyond sport and in life beyond sport. But we also experience success in winning medals or winning tournaments or whatever. So where have you seen, Sean, maybe you can think about your experience with the rowers more recently and winning gold at Olympics, and how did a people-centered kind of approach contribute to that, or was it just that you thrashed yourselves?
Yeah, no, it was, I suppose I have a bit of an interesting perspective on this one because I've certainly been involved in programs within rowing which have been very person-centered and focused, which is what we saw in Tokyo. And I've also been on the other end of that, which is very performance-centered. And I can attribute those to two coaches in particular. So Tony O'Connor, who coached us at the Tokyo Olympics, where we won gold, he was much more of a person-centered approach. And then in my earlier days where we got a decent amount of success, I was coached by a guy named Ian Wright, who was more of the old school hard ass that was more about performance over everything else. And the interesting thing is that I believed in both of those performances, both of those sort of models of the way he coached and the way both of the coaches coached. And the thing that they did, both coaches, is they built a culture around the way they were doing the way that we were doing our work and the way we were going about it. But the key difference for me is that the person-centered approach, which worked for us really well, took a lot of time to build and to build a culture. that person-centered approach that worked in Tokyo is far more sustainable long-term than the pure performance-centered approach. And so what I mean by that is that I think that there's more scope for athletes to burn out earlier when it's purely performance focused. And from there, I think Tony put it in a really good way. He wanted to build really good athletes, but he also wanted to build really good people. And so that was his sort of, that's what he wanted to leave behind in the sport is really accomplished people as well as athletes. Where if you go too far down the performance line, you might end up as a really accomplished athlete, but then what are you beyond that? You might burn out when you're mid-20s and think, always look back and wonder whether you could have kept on going if there was a little bit more balance in the program. And so, yeah, I think that there's sort of a balance in general that needs to be sort of established between the person focused and the performance focused, because coming from an elite sport background, at the end of the day, it is for us about winning medals.
Mm. So Wayne, I'm interested to see then how you see yourself, how you would think about being successful. How do you measure your success as a coach then? Is it about the medal with winning the tournament, or is it about the development of the person? What's success? Yeah,
I've probably got a different way of looking at success than others. Don't get me wrong, winning's important. And when you're a Crusaders coach or an All Blacks coach or a Chiefs coach or whatever, you're in a high performance sport, and so your accomplishment really counts. However, one of the ways I measure, like your trophies sit in the garage and they tarnish over time, but how are your relationships? Do they tarnish? How are you going with the people that you coached years after you've coached them? I think that's one of the measures I like to use. As a high performance coach, you're always on that. There's always that narrow margin between being honest with a player and being seen as a bully. And some of the conversations you have with players can be life-changing for them. But you have to create that. I think you've got to create that relationship with them that they know that you truly care, that you love them, they come stay at your place, have a meal at your place whenever they want. And then you can have that honesty, and sometimes it's brutal honesty and it's not taken that well at the time. But I think if you've spent time creating a relationship, you'll over time you'll get a good result.
Yeah. So, and I'm just going to mix things up for you lot, sorry. So it raises an interesting question about what sort of behaviours then are acceptable of coaches and what aren't. So Sean, you might take it from an athlete perspective. What's acceptable and what wouldn't you expect, but others equally chip in?
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty broad question, but yeah, I think there's definitely been a shift in focus on the well-being of the athlete, and so Wayne's already sort of mentioned it, as sort of the relationship the coach builds with the athlete needs to tread that fine line between being you're being a friend to the athlete, but you're also being the taskmaster, where you're setting the standard. You have to tell the truth, and so that's something that I expect and I believe is fully acceptable for a coach, is to be fully transparent to athletes, and obviously delivering information and whatever's the truth in a very careful way, because again they've got to read the person, and some people take on information or take on criticism in different ways. But at the end of the day, I think full transparency with no favourites in a team is a really fair way of doing things. And yeah, particularly from high performance sport perspective, that all has to be achieved while not compromising the person's well-being.
I think that's a key point, Sean, actually, around the athlete and who they are, where they're at in their playing career, their level of maturity, the support systems got around them, the relationship you have with them. Because as Wayne said, for some, you've got a really strong relationship built over a number of years, and probably the level of honest conversation can be a lot deeper, as opposed to a player that you don't quite have that built with. So I think it does come back to knowing your players, and definitely have not got that right all the time. But rather than saying there's a line that works for everybody, I think the line does shift, or the conversations do shift depending on the athlete.
Yeah, I mean, that sums it up really well, and it comes down to the trust you build between coach and athlete, and that's the good telling of a good relationship, is that they can speak to you in a way that really resonates. And so, like, for me personally, I'll be the first to admit that I was always one that needed the pat on the back, being told that I'm doing a good job, the positive reassurance, where other athletes would need. They respond better to harder critiques, and it's different for everyone, and that's something that obviously the coach has to work out.
If I could just come in there, I started my coaching career in Italy as a player coach. So I went over there, not knowing the language, went to a little town that there was no one in the town who spoke English. So it sort of steered me in a unique way, or unique methodology at the time for rugby coaching. And so there are a couple of things that characterised that. The first thing was I started asking questions of the players, because I wanted to know what they knew about the game, and at the same time I wanted to start learning the language. So it worked in two areas. And what I found was that by asking what questions, I'd get a descriptive answer, and then I really knew that the players had a bit more self-awareness than if I was just telling them what to do and it was going to one ear and out the other. So that was one thing. The second thing was I was exposed to a more global methodology of coaching, so a more game-based learning program than I'd been through in New Zealand. And what I found with that is that whilst there are, some people don't like the game-based or game sense stuff because there's always a lot of mistakes in it. But I found that if you're introducing new ideas and you're making it more difficult constantly, then the mistakes are actually a catalyst for learning. And so there were a couple of things that really worked well for me in Italy. When I came back here, people thought I was wacky, didn't fit the mould of a high-performance rugby coach, certainly in the late 80s. My reinforcement now would be seeing a lot of those methods as a norm today. So that's probably a measure for me more than winning.
Shane, I don't want you to feel like you're missing out on an opportunity to respond, but I feel like you're frozen.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to leave Shane for a minute. I guess all those things then that we've talked about as you as coaches, I'd be interested to hear, Amy Jean, what's the most challenging, what's some of the challenges for you in your role as a coach?
I think for me, the biggest challenge, no matter what team I was coaching, was just balancing coaching with family life. I don't know if it's different for males and females, but I probably, a lot of my coaching was done as a mum. And so coaching is one of those things you put your whole heart, soul and energy into, and to have enough left, I guess, for your family, which was important to me, was a constant juggling act. And you adopt this whole other family when you become a coach. And you need to make every one of those people feel important and special, and that you care. And then you go home, and your most important family still needs that as well. And if you have a bad day at the office or a bad day at work, trying not to bring that home and into the family life, I think was probably one of the biggest challenges. And just so grateful that my family was very supportive and understood all those things. But I think just personally, that was always something that I grappled with.
And I think the demands on coaches have got higher and higher as well. So that makes it even more challenging to balance, right? Yeah. Wayne, from you?
Yeah, when I started coaching, I thought it was easy. It was rugby was amateur. Often you were the sole coach, or you might have an assistant coach helping you. I was lucky. I involved in the Canterbury program. Gilbert Anoka was a great mate of mine. This was back in like 87, 88, 89. And he and I coached together. He provided a mental skills program back there. But the challenge for me has always been nerves, I think. I've always put pressure on myself when I was a player and a coach. When you're in front of the team, it's got to be the best you've ever been in front of the team. And when you're at training, it's got to be the best training ever. And I'm just driven to, it's my makeup, I'm driven to be like that. So I've often struggled with being the little kid from Pataru, being in a famous team within World Rugby. Never saw myself like that, and so yeah, that's probably been my biggest challenge.
And one of your biggest strengths as well, because your humility stands you in good stead, and you should acknowledge that at the same time. And I think we appreciate that. Welcome back, Shane. Love the technology that works for us all the time. I think with that, the whole challenges is, Shane, you work in the unique environment of Belgium and in a different context, and I know, Wayne, you've done that overseas, but how does a person-centred approach, like you take a humanistic approach, fit in that international Olympic level sort of competition?
It fitted really well. Like it's a little bit like Wayne's story, a bit like a little New Zealander in a country such as Belgium, where they have two languages and quite a distinct culture between those two languages. And being a Kiwi sitting in there, you get to see some of the opportunities that present itself that they're blinded to, and we often talk about diversity and the use of different experiences and so on, and we had that within one little country. And because I was no good at speaking French and no good at speaking Flemish, we were able to highlight those as being incredible strengths. They have the ability to speak in the language of the person that's standing in front of them. And that's a great lesson to learn, as a coach. And they also have the same connection or same affinity that I have with New Zealand and Australia. It's kind of that Belgium and Holland is Australia and New Zealand, the bigger country. And so all those type of connections are not necessarily hockey connections, but they're things that bring people closer together. And so what I found was that it was a team that was searching for more of a voice themselves, and the coaching that they had had in the past had been very directive, and so they knew how to play the game incredibly well. A bit like what Sean was saying, you can squeeze that orange, but it was what we were trying to do with that particular group was grow an orange orchard, and produce a lot of players that would come through the program. And now there's sustained success because it's a bit of a conveyor belt, and they have an expectation that when they come into the program that they start to contribute and they learn how to contribute. It's not a given that an athlete knows how to take themselves to places they've never been. And that's a bit what the coach is trying to assist them to do. But at some point in time, they get it. They know how they get in that performance state. They know all the things about nutrition and things like that. And at that point in time, the role of the coach is one of your biggest supporters and your biggest fans. We get to watch from the greatest seats in the whole stadium, right by the field, and love watching these type of things. So, it's a give and take type of thing, but the coaches also are big winners, and if they do a good job.
Yeah. And what about from Sean? You've already kind of talked about it on the international stage. Oh, I can't hear you. Pause. I can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that. It's an interesting one from my perspective, because obviously we spend a lot of time as rowers here in New Zealand training and trying to build what we're doing so we can compete overseas. And where the sort of person-centered approach comes in is that it's built while we're in New Zealand, and we're trying to build confidence in our individual sort of ability and our team ability, and a lot of that is sort of led by the coach. The coach has sort of a objective view of how things are going and how individuals are going, and often as New Zealanders, I think we're traditionally quite hard on ourselves and always think that we're not good enough, or a little bit of for me, it was the imposter syndrome of what is it going to look like when we get overseas and we actually race
internationally. And then the thing I noticed that was sort of different, going over with a person-centered approach, is that we were pretty much only worrying about what was within our control while we were competing. While in previous years, it was always worried about competition. It was always worried about who we were coming up against, how strong these other countries were, how strong the individuals were, what we had seen on social media. And then when we brought it all back to sort of the person-centered approach, it became really simple as to what we were doing. We had a set plan. Each person had their set role, their set job to do, and that's all we focused on within the team. And it was quite liberating in a lot of ways, that you end up just simplifying down what you got to do. And for us, it was all we had to do was go fast in the way we knew how. And it's sort of, one way that we could relate it back to how we sort of approached it from that, from Tony's coaching perspective and the team culture we built. It came back to sort of making it really simple and person-centered and team-centered, rather than being distracted by the many different things you can be distracted by when you're overseas racing at an elite level.
Yeah. So we can talk about it in that high performance elite international level, and what that looks like when you take a person-centered approach. And I go back to your comment about growing the orange orchard, Shane, and I'm really worried that we're trying to squeeze the oranges before they've even formed buds here in New Zealand. We have a sports system around youth and rangatahi that, Sport New Zealand are really trying to address through balances better, and we've got this policy landscape that's changing. Yet we still often see coaches of rangatahi, of youth, thrashing young people too early, in my view. So, Amy Jane, Wayne, and I'm sure Shane, you'd chip into this as well. What can we be doing differently in that space so that we have more coaches working with rangatahi that are focused on them as people, not as future All Blacks, future Black Sticks, future Silver Ferns, future parkour champions?
I love this topic. I love it.
You've got 2 minutes.
At the heart of it, it's what do the kids want? What do their rangatahi, what our tamariki want from sport, and really taking the time to find that out. And I think we're moving in that direction, trying to capture that voice and find out what they want. I think there's some really key players. I think it is a system change issue. Key players, people who organise youth sport. What do our competition structures look like? How are they catering for the needs of rangatahi, tamariki? Schools, what are our schools doing to ensure that it's a person-centred approach, that it is a growing the orchard approach as opposed to squeezing the orange? I don't think a lot of our successful school programs, in terms of those that win national titles, and I don't think that is a sustainable model for those individual athletes, and what they potentially go on to do or not do because of burnout or overloading. I think coaches have a role to play. Again, that's why we're here. But if you just listen to this over and over again, this whole presentation, you'll hear the same words. Participant-centred, player-centred. And I think the other thing for me is parents, and just allowing their children to enjoy sport for what it is, not for what it could be or where it could take them. And the big lesson for me as a parent, I'll put my hand up and say I had all the wrong conversations in the car on the way home after matches. But I think, when they're young, there's all these things, these variables to their performance, growth, hormones, social distractions, school and study, family life, all these things that can change the way they play from one week to the other. So I think expecting that rangatahi will go out there and try new things, feel good about doing things, necessarily doing things right all the time, which sometimes we put those, I look at what I did as part of the Magic high performance environment and what's happening in schools. And some of these rangatahi are training harder more often without the managed rest breaks, without the the time between training sessions. They're truly overloaded, even compared to high performance sports. So yeah, it's a big system change, but really has to be on development as opposed to outcome. That's my spiel.
No, we've got any part of the 2 minute left? Because I think one of the things with that is adaptation. There's no opportunity for a young athlete to mentally and physically adapt. Like the season starts and it is so full so quickly, and you have an athlete getting to the end of it and thinking, whew, I made it. Thank goodness it's over. I can do something else. And what we want is an athlete that starts the season and is a much better athlete at the end of the season and much better person, but wants to start the next season, because they want to see themselves improving again. And for me, that's one of the fundamental things that's not operating at the moment with a lot of the athletes. It's a common concern as we go around the country.
I could just come in there. I was director of coaching for Canterbury from 88 through till about 92. And I used to look after junior rugby on Hagley Park any given Saturday. And you can imagine, it was a massive park, massive number of fields for rugby. First thing I did was get these sandwich boards made up with codes of behaviour on them. But they weren't for the players, they're for the parents. And, you learn pretty quickly that winning isn't really important for the kids, or it certainly doesn't guarantee satisfaction in kids. I learned to play my game, my sport, doing backyard rugby down the street. No coaches, played bull rush, played different games, and we learnt off each other. And then when I got into a more organised team, you basically had parents in gumboots running around telling you what to do. So I think the coaching movement's really important in this area. That New Zealand Rugby, I think, led the field in coach education for a large number of years, probably through the 70s, 80s, 90s. People like Laurie O'Reilly who ran courses. We had RDOs in every small area. Every province had RDOs who then had a network of staff coaches that got around schools, worked with teachers, worked with junior coaches. We had coaching levels, courses run virtually every weekend. It was massive in that period, and we developed our young coaches. I don't know if that is how it is today, or whether we've taken our eye off the ball there, but certainly it's an area where we need a lot of money and a lot of development put into.
And this is just a curler, it's not on the list, anybody, but it does make me think about the change to professionalism in sport and the filtering down of adult forms of sport into young people. So, it concerns me that there's a rugby for tots program and a not netball for tots program where we can specialise, and our early childhood centre can take kids to a rugby tournament. It might be flags, but they're at a rugby tournament at that level. So that drift down of professionalism, the parents who are paying for individual coaching for their 8-year-old so that they can make that elite team by the time they're 10. How do we arrest this system? What do we do? What do we do differently?
I think if I can pick up on what Wayne said about his childhood and just playing, I think that's missing. Allowing rangatahi and tamariki time to just play, not in anything structured, not in anything organised, not in anything that requires a timetable. And that means at a certain age, you're obviously going to take part in the competition, but the kids that love sport will still, I know there's lots to compete with, esports and online distractions, but the ones that love it will still go out and kick a ball around or throw a ball around or make up a game with their mates in the street. I think that's really important.
Cool. So I should get us back on track, but I guess the thing about that is you've all adopted or experienced, in your case, Sean, a very player-centred, athlete-centred, people-centred approach. So if you were to be working with a group of coaches or an individual coach that you wanted to shift further down that part into that part of the world or that view of the world, what would be one thing you've tried and you've used and you think would help get them there? What would be a tip or an idea that they could draw on, or something they could try with their team next week and the weeks to come that might start moving them there? What would be your biggest thing you'd change?
Yeah, we've sort of I think we've sort of touched on it already, but I believe that you get more out of the individual when you understand the individual and you understand what motivates them. And I think Wayne touched on this, is that placing more weight on the fact that there is some real importance in learning the heritage and learning the legacy, learning the reason why we're doing this. And so I think the one message I would give to coaches, or the one thing that I think that could develop coaches, is that you do think about those beyond just the technical things that need to happen for a team to be successful. You think about the big picture, you think about the culture, you think about the way the team works together. And we have this really interesting thing at Rowan New Zealand. It's called the Pathway Coaching System, which is relatively new for Rowan New Zealand. And I think there's a perception that to be sort of successful at the elite level, you have to just work hard. And although that's very true, it does start somewhere else, where we're thinking about why we're working hard and what's the purpose of this. And we're trying to develop the people first. And so the pathway system for coaches allows them to come into Rowan New Zealand and actually sit with the other elite coaches and sit with the teams and just see how they're doing it. And I think that's a really important thing in terms of developing coaches around the country, is that they get some exposure to how the top, like the national level teams are coaching, how they're operating. And our coach, Tony, would even just every week he'd bring out a new coach in the coach boat, just so they could get some perspective on the way we operate, the words that we use, and how it's from the outside. It's not just hard work. There's a lot that's focused on the person. And it's quite interesting, because then there's a lot of feedback given from the other coaches that have come in. And so it was a really good, useful tool for Tony as well, because he got perspective from sort of both sides. And so, I think that I'm not sure if that's really answered the question, but that's something that I sort of found was really valuable, as giving a little bit of perspective on the way we do things, and letting that trickle down. So we're not getting athlete burnout at those younger stages, because that's prevalent in rowing as well, where high school programs are almost as hard as elite programs, which is insane.
It's an interesting question, I think, because some of the best coaches I've ever seen in my life are junior coaches. There's a guy, Gianni Bugno, in Treviso in Italy, who I went to schools with, and he was an extraordinary coach, and I just learnt so much off him about how, not just how to deal with kids, but how to teach the game. I think, as I said before, that the parents are really important for our junior sport, and perhaps they need to be at the courses. And if you could talk your parents into buying a pie for their kid because he went up and over and beyond for the team that week, whether it was turning up early to training or picking up all the balls after training or making more tackles than anyone else or whatever it is, rather than you get a pie for winning or scoring the most tries. Yeah. But coaching them, I think, is important for our future.
Amy Jean and Shane, do you want to chip into this one?
Amy Jean? No, I think it's been covered off pretty well, actually. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I guess I would pick up on a couple of points that were made earlier too, that, I think you made the point about good questioning, parent education, values, all those things come into play. But picking up on your point, Sean, if we want to take those things, we actually have to plan our coaching. We can't just rock up 5 minutes before and throw a ball out, or I hate that we're only talking about ball sports really, apart from you, Sean, but there are a whole range of other sports out there. So how do we plan in ways that grow a wider range of skill sets, as opposed to just come along and do drills every time? So planning, I think, would be key to it for me there too.
Yes, I would say that a lot of our coaches actually wouldn't identify as coaches, particularly in youth sport. The people that put their hands up because nobody else will do it, or because they've got a child playing, or they love sport. And so I think sometimes it's redefining what a coach looks like, and that it doesn't have to be somebody who's played themselves or knows a lot about the actual sport, but really encouraging those people to come forward who are good at relationships and enjoy working within a sport regardless of their experiences, and giving people the confidence to put their hand up to do those roles.
So how do we develop and grow those people? Because we have a shortage of volunteers. We know that there's real issues around volunteerism. So how do we support and develop coaches at all levels? I think the high performance people get cracking great support. They've got, lots of time and lots of money put into them, but the people that work with tamariki and rangatahi often are left hanging. What do we do that doesn't consume more of their time but can support them? Go, Wayne.
I'll provide more opportunities for them to learn. Opportunities. We often in rugby we often talk about how do we get the community to come to us? How do we get more support in the community? It's the wrong question. What can we do for community? What can rugby do for community? And so I think we've got to do more for them, assist them, educate them, make sure that they're enjoying the experience and that their kids are.
And also celebrate them, like it's one of those tasks that you give and give and give, and it's nice when someone gives some recognition back. I think that's that's a little bit missed sometimes in coaching. It's a bit of a calling, and if you do it well, then you have such a big impact. And I think we don't always celebrate the fact that a coach has that mana, and it's important.
One thing I was going to say, Kirsten, sorry about questioning is a really good way to get people into coaching, because often parents or whoever going into coaching their kids' team don't have a lot of knowledge about the sport and are scared to get into it because they don't really know what to coach or how to coach. So getting them to ask questions of the kids can be a really important way to get them into it, because they don't actually need to know the answer, but learning how to question is just as important. And I found early on that if you ask someone why they did something, they get a bit embarrassed and they think you're having a crack at them, or they feel they've got to justify themselves. So trying to get little descriptive answers from kids, so what did you see there, when you made that pass? What would you do next time if that player came in? I think it's a really good way to get people involved in the sport.
Do you think part of the challenge of that is that often we see like people who volunteer in that space with tamariki when their children are in that at that level, but to progress there's the sense that you have to progress. Like I can't just stick coaching with rangatahi. That might be my passion, that might be my strength, but if I want to progress I've got to go up the levels. At the same time, to go up the levels, actually I need to be a high performance athlete, don't I? Don't I have to have competed for New Zealand to coach in a New Zealand program? Is that not the mandate? And so I'm kind of confused. Where do we find our coaches and how do we support them in those different ways? Or is that just being a little problematic?
It's actually a bit of a danger. Like it's a bit like teaching. You get some fantastic teaching, and then you move them through the system, and they become a principal, and they're not such a good principal because they haven't, not in this case, but they haven't necessarily demonstrated those skills. If you celebrate the coaches that are working in the areas that are producing fantastic programs, really enjoyable programs, keep them in there, resource them well, celebrate them, and keep them doing what they're doing. It's a very select few that will go all the way and become a high performance coach, and often we just don't protect enough those ones that are very good at the age groups and celebrate what they're doing, because it's so important. There's always a history. There'll be a history in rugby, there'll be a history in rowing of coaches that coach in age group categories that produce these players from little places that constantly come through and become world champions. Keep them there. They're doing fantastic, but celebrate them and resource them really well.
Yeah, I have a bit of a funny story around that. That's what Tony was. He was one of those coaches that was just producing athletes out of Christ College over and over again. And we got to the point where we just sniped him because we wanted him. So I'm not sure if it was the right thing to do. He's actually gone back to Christ College after going and winning a gold in Tokyo. So that's a good story on his behalf. But that's what we saw, is he was producing good athletes over and over again. And so we sought him out as a New Zealand team. And on the other end of that, you talked, Kirsten, about how a lot of athletes a lot of coaches have been athletes in the past. And we have a really interesting example of somebody who wasn't, certainly not at the elite level, and that's James Coote within the New Zealand rowing team. And he coached the women's double to silver at the Olympics. And his background wasn't high performance rowing. It was he came from a more analytical point of view, and he's a fantastic coach that brought a different perspective that wasn't just from an athlete perspective.
So I guess that lends itself to a broader question for me, is that we have a sports system that has run in particular ways for a very long time, and gets reproduced by a whole range of people in power who are benefiting from that. There's flaws in our sports system because we see huge amounts of dropout for young people, for people who leave university and go into the workforce or become parents and families. We don't have volunteers. So what would be one thing you might change in the sports system in Aotearoa, New Zealand, if we wanted to do more development of the whole person? What would be a change you'd make? And I'm going to start with you, Wayne, and then open it up for others.
Provide funding, I think, for those people who are dropping out of volunteer jobs. You look at I look at rugby clubs, for example, and people haven't got time to do stuff for nothing anymore. There are busy lives going on, and so I think funding's a really key thing. And then a network of education. Making sure that there's a strong ability in every area to create coaches and to give coach education. I think Shane talked about country areas before. That's where most, if you look at the stats, most of the All Blacks through history have come from rural areas, and they've done that because they play multiple sports. They often fill in adult teams, so they're learning decision making. And they are more likely to be outside playing with a ball than playing PlayStation inside. So there's a lot of possibilities, I think, getting into those rural areas and making sure that the education is spread through there. They then get picked up by Christ College.
Yeah, the people who've got the money and the power.
Yeah.
We'll just leave those comments aside, probably.
I think it's there's a little bit of a redefining about when and where sport happens. We traditionally said sport happens at the weekend. Have to have so many trainings during the week, and maybe it's an opportunity. I think COVID has presented lots of opportunities actually to reflect and review on how we deliver sport and what what competitions run when, and how they run. And maybe it's a time to just rethink, for sports to think about maybe having midweek competitions to free up the weekend for family time, or if I think about rangatahi, allow them to have the weekends to have a job or socialise, whatever that looks like. But I guess it's identifying what those barriers are to the volunteers taking place, and seeing if we can work a system that that buys more time from somewhere, or allows them to get involved and commit to something. I don't know what the complete answer is. Which might also
sit with shortening seasons, because once upon a time you could play, I could play softball and I could play hockey when I was a youth. But nowadays you can't, because they roll together so much. And so where do I get to have that multi-sport experience? What does that look like? So there's a whole range of those things. Shane, you come at probably a bit differently too, having your experiences both here in New Zealand as a young person, not that you're not young any longer, and then moving to Belgium. What are some things we might change here or learn from, noting that our context is different?
Yeah, well, it is a very complex system here in New Zealand. So the simplicity of Belgium is quite charming in a way. So what happens is often a young family or a family with youngsters will join a club, whether it's a hockey club or a tennis club, and often they're linked. And it's an event to go there. So the whole family goes, you spend the day there. It's not a drive-in, drop-off, speed back out. It's actually it's building a bit of that culture in around belonging to something and so on. And some of the things that we've spoken about are really evident there. So my boy plays hockey there, and he's 7. So he arrives, and they arrive half an hour early. They play. There's a field that's just set up for them to play. There's 4 or 5 games going on. No umpiring, no coaching. All the new skills coming out and on display. Then they play a little game. After the game, they go in as a team, and they have a little meal together, and it's just a simple pasta and stuff like that. And they hang around. And they hang around for an hour or so, and the parents are also hanging around. In Belgium, it's 10:30 in the morning on a Sunday. So of course you have a beer and you mix and mingle with other parents. But it's a really nice feeling, and it's a feeling of belonging, and it covers off a lot of those cultural things. But they can also track their players really well, so they're not playing for 4 or 5 different teams. Their week is regulated, and each week is slightly different, so that they're getting different experiences. Their schooling stops on Wednesday at 12 in the morning, and then in the afternoon they have cultural or a sport experience, and so they go to the club, and then again they do their homework at the club, and they have a training session, and then there's a movie night or something. So it's different. It's different, and it's simple, and I think we can learn a few lessons with that, because I think that the system is very complicated in New Zealand, and every athlete has a number of masters that none of them by themselves are causing any harm, but there's so many of them that they layer on top of each other.
So I'm just conscious we've got 3 minutes, which is going to give you 30 seconds each to answer this last question. So what would be the biggest challenge facing our coaching industry, I'm using that broadly, in Aotearoa New Zealand, that we need to be aware of and we should pick up next time we come together to have a chat? Amy Jane, you kick off, then we'll roll through.
Okay, I'm going to give the female perspective and say we need to promote and support more female coaches in sport.
Wayne?
Yep, for me, mental health, it's way more overt and talked about today than in the past. So building more grit and resilience within your coaching program for your players, I think is important. If you want any material, Martin Seligman from Penn State University, his book called Flourish is really good on simple strategies such as showing gratitude, having laughter, engagement, relationships, all those things, social capital within your team. There's some really good information in that book.
Sean?
I agree with what's been said. And I think mental health has become a key focus, and it's an important focus of sport and the way that coaches do their job. And so addressing that and forming a framework to sort of handle when those issues arise, and then also accessibility. So making sure that sport is accessible to everyone in all age groups consistently.
Yeah. Shane?
Yeah, mine would be added to that would be recognising that new generations are coming through with new needs, and catering for those needs the best we can covers off some of those things that have been listed there. So I think that is an understanding as well.
I recognise it's a shame. I feel like we could sit here for the night and have a chat. It would be much better if we were at a dinner table having a lot of kai to go with us. I really appreciate the contribution you've all made. I'm sure we'll be able to come back together and chat about this in the future. You continue to lead well and coach well and grow coaches and contribute to our sporting community really broadly. So thank you for your ongoing work and your contribution tonight. So tēnā anō tātou ki ngā kai kōrero o te kaupapa aku rangatira. Nā mihi nui Ka te rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora. Have a nice evening all.
Bye.